What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because last night my sister sent me a text that hit harder than anything she had ever said to me, and it read, word for word, "The family dinner is for the successful ones, not you." And I cannot tell you how many times I stared at those words on the screen, wondering if I should respond with anger, sarcasm, or silence. But in the end, I just set my phone down and let the sting settle, because I knew there was no point in trying to fight someone who had already decided I was beneath her. To be completely honest, this was not the first time Lauren had found a way to remind me that in her eyes I was the underachiever, the one who never quite measured up. The sister who somehow turned ambition into embarrassment because I refused to take the traditional corporate ladder she worshipped, and yet the bluntness of that message was so raw it made every old scar from years of subtle digs reopen all at once. I had always known where I stood in the family ranking, somewhere below her polished job titles, her curated social media updates, and her habit of organizing these so-called celebrations that always seemed more like stages where she could perform success rather than dinners where people could genuinely connect, but seeing it written out so directly was another level. So what did I do? I ordered takeout, the same cheap Thai noodles I get when I want comfort without effort, and I sat on my couch convincing myself not to let her bait me into some late-night family drama, because what she did not know, what she could not have possibly imagined, was that I had been living with the biggest secret of my life for months. For weeks my world had revolved around one single date, the expiration of a press embargo attached to a deal so large it still felt unreal even as I stared at the contract on my laptop. My attorney had drilled into me the importance of saying nothing until the official release, because one slip, one premature mention, could jeopardize not only the announcement but the integrity of the agreement itself, and so I had kept my mouth shut, not even whispering the details to friends, and certainly not to family members who loved to gossip over Sunday brunch. I had spent that entire day on back-to-back calls, going over the last compliance checks with my attorney Ava, reviewing the media strategy with the corporate communications team at the partner company, and making sure every single number, every clause, and every word of that press release was flawless. By the time Lauren's text arrived, my nerves were already raw from the weight of holding in such enormous news, and it almost felt like the universe was setting me up for the most brutal irony. Her telling me I was not successful enough to sit at the table on the exact night the world was about to learn I had just signed a $120 million contract with one of the largest pharmacy chains in the country. I flipped on the television more out of habit than anything, scrolling past channels until I landed on the evening news, half listening while I picked at the noodles, when suddenly the anchor's tone shifted into that dramatic cadence they use for breaking stories. And there it was, my company's name on the screen, my face pulled from a professional headshot I had almost forgotten I ever took, and the words announcing the deal that had consumed every ounce of my energy for over a year. I froze, chopsticks in hand, watching as the anchor described how our platform would be rolled out nationwide, how it was projected to improve scheduling efficiency across hundreds of clinics, and how the contract, valued at over $100 million, was a significant step forward in healthcare technology. The surreal part was not hearing the number or seeing the footage, because I had rehearsed those details in my head countless times. The surreal part was knowing that Lauren, sitting in her carefully staged family dinner with her curated guest list of winners, was probably hearing it at the exact same moment. I could almost picture her face tightening, the way she gets when the spotlight shifts without her permission, and for once I did not feel anger or vindication. I just felt an odd calm. Like all the years of swallowing her comments had led to this quiet moment where I did not have to say a single word because the news was doing all the talking for me. My phone started buzzing so aggressively that I thought it might actually fall off the coffee table. First it was texts from colleagues, then from distant relatives, and then finally the dreaded family group chat, which lit up with a silence so loud it almost made me laugh. The first message came from my dad, short and tentative, asking, "Is this really true?" And before I could even respond, Lauren chimed in with something that made my jaw drop. I knew this was coming. I just didn't want to spoil the surprise. That was classic Lauren, rewriting the story in real time, trying to slide herself back into the center as if she had been in on it all along, as if I had been holding back because I was waiting for her approval. For a split second, I wanted to type out a message that would put her in her place once and for all, to finally call out the years of condescension and exclusion. But instead, I forced myself to take a breath and remember the advice Ava had repeated to me so many times. The most powerful move is restraint, because silence backed by truth always outlives noise backed by insecurity. So I kept it simple. I dropped a single link to the official press release with one neutral line. Embargo just lifted, had to keep it quiet. That was it. No gloating, no sharp edges, no dragging up the years of being belittled, just the truth and nothing more, because I realized in that moment that I did not need to prove anything to her or to anyone else in that room she had deemed worthy. As the messages kept rolling in, with relatives suddenly congratulating me, and even a few "proud of you" notes from people who had never once asked how I was doing, I felt something shift inside me. The dinner I was excluded from had just turned into the biggest unspoken invitation of my life, and for the first time I understood that I got to choose who had a seat at my table, not the other way around. And that's where I'll leave you for now, because the real question is not what happened in that moment, but what happened next. When the dinner ended, the news kept spreading, and the people who had dismissed me as unsuccessful suddenly realized they might need me more than I ever needed them. Can you guess what happened next? By the time the sun dragged itself into the next morning and my phone had finally stopped vibrating like a trapped bee in a jar, the group chat had transformed from stiff silence into a clumsy parade of congratulations, mixed with revisions of history that would have made a politician blush, and in the middle of all that noise came a separate text from my mother who, in the gentle tone she saves for moments when she wants me to swallow something that does not go down easy, told me that the dinner my sister had defined as for the successful ones had, in light of recent developments, become a family celebration, and it would mean a lot if I could attend and show grace, which in our house has always been code for not making Lauren feel small even when she has made everyone else feel smaller. I stared at that message and felt the familiar tug to be the peacemaker, to be the one who makes everything smoother so the night can end without raised voices, and then I thought about the way Lauren had moved to reframe the story within minutes of the news breaking, dropping that line about having known all along, as if she had been the quiet architect of my life, and I had just been the messy contractor doing the labor, and the hum that ran under my ribs turned into something steady and useful, not anger exactly, more like a decision forming, because I realized I could go without performing, I could sit at that table without auditioning for a role I never wanted. I could let people react however they needed to react and still keep my own boundaries intact. So I said yes, I would come, and I told myself I would arrive late and leave early, not out of pettiness, but because I wanted to control the edges of the night, to remember that I had a choice in how long I stayed in rooms that drained me. And before I even put on my shoes, I made one small phone call that ended up being the most satisfying move of the evening, because I called the restaurant, asked for the manager, and arranged for the bill to be handled in advance by my card with a note to email a copy of the receipt to the person listed as the host, which, of course, was Lauren, since she had created a little seating chart and a little speech and a little version of events that placed her squarely at the center where she believes she belongs. When I walked in, the room snapped to attention in that awkward way families do when they have to pivot from dismissing you to celebrating you without acknowledging the pivot. And there were hugs that lasted a little too long and comments about how proud everyone had always been, and Lauren, with her professional smile, asked if I could say a few words about the journey later, and I said we would see, which meant no. Because I was not there to feed her program, I was there to look people in the eye and decide who could cross into this new chapter with me without trying to own it. At the table, the talk flowed toward the usual topics, half gossip and half performance, with a few relatives dropping hints about internships, referrals, and a cousin who needed a fresh start after making a series of choices that would have sunk anyone without a last name that opened doors, and I listened, nodded, and then did something that felt both kind and firm, which was to give clear, boring steps instead of magic keys, things like applications, milestones, and monthly check-ins with no guarantees, and it was remarkable how quickly the conversation shifted when it became obvious that I was not selling fairy dust, I was selling work, and therefore I was not the shortcut people had hoped I would be. Lauren, sensing her grip on the room loosening, stood to make a toast that was sweet enough to pass, but sharp enough to land, calling me visionary and resilient while reminding everyone that families shape winners. A line that tried to fold my success into her brand without naming it, and I smiled, raised my glass, and let it pass. Because the manager had already done the only speech I needed to make when he quietly told her between courses that the bill was taken care of and the receipt would be in her inbox shortly, and I watched the tiniest flicker cross her face when she understood she would be praised for hosting a dinner that, in fact, she had not paid for, which meant the scoreboard she lives by had just slipped from her fingers without a scene. Without a fight, without me saying a single cutting word. After dessert, she pulled me into the hallway and suggested, with that brittle brightness that always means do it or else, that we take a photo together for optics, a word she uses so often it might as well be her child's name. And I told her I was not a prop and I was not in the mood to pose for a story that was not real, and she called me ungrateful in that clipped whisper people use when they are worried someone might overhear. And I said that gratitude does not require me to stand in front of a camera to validate anyone's timeline, and then I walked back to the table, hugged our parents, thanked the staff, and slipped out into the night before anyone could do the thing they always do, which is to try to fix the truth with a staged picture that would later be used to prove a closeness that does not exist. When I got home, I checked my email and saw the copy of the restaurant receipt that had gone to Lauren, and I felt that small, clean click of satisfaction you get when a boundary holds, not because you yelled, but because you designed the situation so shouting was unnecessary. I made tea, sat with my shoes still on, and let the quiet sink in, and then my phone lit up with a notification that made the tea taste metallic. Because there was a post circulating that twisted the night into a version I did not recognize, a version that only one person in that room could have authored, and I understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that the next move would have to be bigger than dinner and smarter than a clap back. Because the story was no longer about who paid the bill, it was about who held the microphone and who decided what got recorded as the truth. By the time I opened my eyes the next morning, I already knew something had shifted. Because my phone was glowing with alerts and one particular notification pulled me straight out of the grogginess into the kind of sharp focus that only comes when you realize somebody has tried to rewrite the story in real time, and sure enough, there it was. A carefully staged photo of my sister standing at the entrance of the restaurant, captioned with a smug line about how she had helped build the right connections that made last night's deal possible. A sentence so slippery and so calculated that it did not outright lie, but it strongly suggested that she was the quiet puppeteer behind the contract, and as I scrolled through the comments, filled with her friends congratulating her for being such a powerful connector and praising her behind-the-scenes work, I felt that familiar churn in my stomach, the one that mixes anger with disbelief, because I knew she had just crossed into territory that could actually damage me if left unchecked. The first thing I did was take screenshots, not because I wanted souvenirs of her pettiness, but because I have learned the hard way that you always need a record when people start blurring lines between personal digs and professional implications. And then I sent those screenshots to Ava, my attorney, with a simple message asking her to confirm whether this caption posed any risk in relation to the publicity clauses we had been so careful about during the contract negotiations. Within an hour, she called me back, calm as always, her voice carrying that steady firmness that makes you feel like no matter how messy the situation looks, there is always a way to handle it if you stick to facts and documents. And she reminded me that while Lauren's post was irritating and misleading, the smartest play was not to blast her publicly but to quietly establish a record that showed we had addressed the misrepresentation and given her a chance to correct it. So instead of writing the angry message that was burning a hole in my chest, I crafted something much cleaner, almost boring in its precision, and I texted Lauren directly with 2 links. One to the official filing that listed the negotiating parties of the contract, and one to the non-disparagement language embedded in the agreement, followed by a short line that said, "For accuracy. Your caption should not suggest involvement that isn't reflected in these documents." I knew she would read it as condescending. I knew she would probably roll her eyes and fire back some emoji or dismissive remark, but I also knew that I had done exactly what Ava had advised, which was to put the truth in front of her and keep a record of it, so that if this ever grew into something bigger, I would be standing on solid ground while she was standing on sand. Her reply came exactly as expected, a string of half-ironic emojis followed by "Relax, it was just a post. People know what I meant," and then a few minutes later the caption changed from "helped build the right connections" to something bland and less dangerous, though still dripping with her usual attempt to tether herself to my work. But I did not take the bait. I did not engage. I just screenshotted the new version, filed it alongside the old one, and felt the satisfaction of knowing that I had not only defended the boundary, but had documented the entire sequence, leaving her no room to twist it later. Still, I realized that fighting her caption by caption was a losing game, because she thrived on constant microdramas, little bursts of attention where she could play both the instigator and the victim, and I was not going to spend my days cleaning up after her. So I came up with something different. Something that felt both protective and empowering. I created a shared online folder, labeled simply "Transparency," and into that folder I placed the official press release, the regulatory filings, the FAQ that our communications team had circulated, and one additional document that mattered deeply to me, a draft of a scholarship line of credit I was setting up in our hometown for students who wanted to study health technology, with the first funding tranche already earmarked from my signing bonus. My reasoning was simple. The next time anyone in the family or beyond tried to twist the story, I could point them not to a fight, not to a vague denial, but to a folder full of facts and a path that replaced gossip with something tangible and good. I did not announce the folder with fireworks. I just quietly added my parents' emails, a few relatives who had already reached out with questions, and even Lauren herself, because I wanted her to see that the truth was not something she could edit or crop. It was something that lived in documents bigger than her captions. When I hit share, I felt a calm I had not felt in years, the calm that comes when you stop playing defense and start building systems that outlast the noise. Of course, I barely had time to sip my coffee before the phone rang again, this time from a reporter I had never spoken to and who, suspiciously, knew details about my family's role in my professional journey. And that was when I understood with chilling clarity that Lauren had been seeding little narratives outside of Instagram, whispering half-truths into ears that could amplify them in ways far more damaging than a few likes on a post. And I knew then that if I wanted to protect what I had built, I could not simply correct captions. I would have to take control of the microphone itself, and that realization set the stage for my next move, one that would not only silence the noise but would decide, once and for all, who got to tell the story of my life. When that reporter's voice came through the line with a tone that carried both curiosity and a subtle edge, asking me to confirm whether my sister had been instrumental in securing introductions that supposedly led to the deal, I felt the blood rush to my temples because I understood in that instant that we had moved beyond petty family captions and into the dangerous territory where reputation, credibility, and the long-term integrity of my work were now being pulled into question by someone who was determined to stand in my shadow while convincing others she had switched on the light. I kept my voice steady, thanked the reporter for reaching out, and said that I would be happy to provide an official statement through the communications team, which bought me enough time to hang up, take a deep breath, and remind myself that I had to play a much bigger game than family politics now, because once the press picks up a storyline, even a shaky one, it can take on a life of its own and spin so far out of control that the truth barely stands a chance unless you anchor it quickly with something undeniable. I called Ava again, relayed what had just happened, and she was blunt. The only way to shut this down was to take the narrative away from those who were bending it, which meant being proactive instead of reactive, offering something to the press that was compelling enough to eclipse the whispers and steering the conversation back toward what mattered: the work, the company, the actual results, rather than the family sideshow. It was advice that stung a little because I knew it meant stepping into the spotlight in a way I had always resisted. But in that moment I saw clearly that silence was no longer protection, it was an invitation for others to define me. And if I wanted my story told correctly, I had to decide who got to hold the microphone and under what conditions. So I made a calculated choice. Instead of granting interviews to every outlet that came knocking, I reached out to one reporter I trusted, someone known for dismantling fluff pieces and for digging into the messy reality of how businesses actually get built. When she agreed to meet, I laid everything out on the table. The nights I had slept in the office because deadlines did not care about exhaustion. The prototypes that failed so spectacularly I wondered if I was delusional for even trying. The rejections from investors who told me my idea was too niche or that I lacked the right polish, and the year I nearly folded because payroll outweighed revenue until one hospital system took a gamble that changed everything. I told her about the mentors who had challenged me without coddling me, about Javier, who had vouched for me when others hesitated, and about the team that stuck around even when money was thin because they believed in what we were building. When the article came out, it did exactly what I needed it to do. It killed the narrative that my family had greased the wheels, because the piece made it painfully clear that no amount of family connections could have carried me through years of rejection, trial, and near collapse. Instead of a glossy profile, it was raw, honest, and very human, which made the whispers about family connections sound ridiculous in comparison, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the balance of power tilt back toward me. Because the facts had been documented and amplified in a way that was louder than Lauren's embellishments could ever hope to be. But of course, Lauren did not take the shift quietly. She called me with a pitch that she should be handling my public relations, that I clearly needed someone to shape the narrative and manage optics, and she even suggested drawing up a retainer agreement where she would be my PR consultant. I almost laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, the way she could twist a setback into a proposal that still kept her in the middle. But instead of laughing, I let her talk, thanked her for the offer, and then told her I had already moved in a different direction, which was technically true because the direction I had chosen was one that left her entirely out of the picture. Still, I wanted something more than just a polite no, something that would feel like justice without turning cruel, so I made another calculated move. I nominated her for a volunteer consulting slot with a nonprofit organization that measured results not by optics or hashtags, but by outcomes. The kind of place where she could either step up and prove that her skills were more than image maintenance or find herself exposed when performance, not perception, was the metric. I sent her name in quietly, without fanfare, and when the nonprofit accepted, I felt that same clean satisfaction I had felt when the dinner bill landed in her inbox. Because once again the scoreboard had shifted in a way that was undeniable and irreversible without me raising my voice or making a scene. Meanwhile, the invitations started pouring in: speaking gigs, panel discussions, galas where the word honoree was suddenly attached to my name, and I decided then and there that I would establish rules for myself. Rules that would keep me from being turned into a prop or a token. No panels where women were simply added as decoration, no events that paid in exposure, no handlers who wanted to control my words, and no family intermediaries who thought they could trade access for influence. For the first time, I felt like I was not just reacting to the waves, I was steering the boat, and it was liberating in a way I had never known before. And then came the gala invitation, with a little line at the bottom that said +1, and I knew immediately that this was the perfect stage for my next move, because whoever I brought with me would send a message louder than any speech, louder than any caption. Louder even than the article that had already shifted the narrative, and as I filled in that name on the RSVP form, I smiled to myself, knowing that when I walked into that ballroom, the gasps would say everything I did not have to say out loud. When the night of the gala finally arrived, I could feel the weight of the past weeks pressing against me like an invisible hand on my shoulder, reminding me of every slight, every accusation, and every attempt to reshape my story into something that never belonged to me. And yet as I walked into that grand ballroom with my chosen guest beside me, I knew that this moment was not about vengeance in the loud, messy sense of the word. It was about finally seizing control of the narrative, about proving to myself that I could decide who deserved access to my victories and who would remain on the outside until they proved they were capable of meeting me where I stood rather than demanding that I shrink to fit their stage. The name I had written on that RSVP line had not been a boyfriend or a business partner or even a mentor from my recent past. It was Mrs. Carmichael, my high school guidance counselor. The woman who once looked me in the eye at 17 years old and told me, with that weary certainty adults sometimes mistake for wisdom, that I should lower my expectations and pick an easier path because girls like you don't end up running companies, they end up disappointed. Bringing her as my guest was not a cruel attempt to humiliate her, but rather a deliberate way of reframing my own history in front of the very people who now wanted to paint me as an overnight success. It was my way of holding up a mirror to the voices that had tried to limit me and showing that I had turned their doubt into fuel. When we walked into that ballroom and the announcer read her name next to mine, there was an audible ripple of surprise, the kind of gasp that sweeps through a room when people realize they are witnessing a statement being made without a single word spoken. And I could see Lauren in the audience, her face frozen in that half-smile that always falters when she realizes the script has been rewritten without her input. Later, when I stood at the podium to give my brief remarks, I did not talk about revenue or contracts or numbers, because anyone with an internet connection already knew those details. Instead, I spoke about the years when failure had been my constant companion, about the rejection letters I had saved in a drawer because I needed to remind myself that I was not imagining the uphill climb, about the loneliness of working nights and weekends while everyone else seemed to be moving forward in socially acceptable, linear ways. And then I told the room about Mrs. Carmichael, how her words had cut me down at the time, but had planted in me a stubbornness to prove, not to her specifically, but to the world, that I was not going to be boxed in by anyone's limited imagination. I turned to her, thanked her sincerely, and announced the creation of a scholarship in her name for students who were told they were aiming too high, because I wanted those kids to know that disappointment was not inevitable, that limits were often projections of other people's fears, and that sometimes the best way to answer doubt was not through argument, but through achievement. The applause that followed was not polite, it was visceral, and for the first time in my life, I felt what it was like to hold the microphone and shape the story fully on my own terms. After the speeches and the dinner, as people mingled and cameras flashed, I knew that Lauren was waiting for her moment, and sure enough, she approached with that careful posture of someone who is desperate to salvage control yet terrified of another public misstep. She asked, quietly but firmly, if we could at least take a photo together to show unity, and I looked her in the eye and told her that unity was not something you staged for the camera, it was something you lived through honesty and respect. And until she could practice those things without trying to attach herself to my work or distort the truth, there was nothing worth capturing. She looked stung, but she did not argue, because for once the audience was not hers to manipulate, and in that silence I felt a freedom I had never felt at any family table. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the flood of emails and texts that had poured in overnight. And I realized that the power no longer came from shutting doors on people who had underestimated me, but from choosing deliberately which doors to open and under what conditions. So I created a new structure for our family communication, one that reflected the reality of my boundaries. 3 separate channels, one for general updates, one for logistics like birthdays or holidays, and one called Boundaries, where rules were written plainly about respect, accuracy, and truth. I also created a private thread for just my parents, where conversations could happen without Lauren filtering or framing them, and then I quietly removed her as the admin of the family calendar she had always used as her stage, making it clear that control of my time and my presence was no longer up for grabs. Finally, I sent one last message that carried no anger, no insults, only truth. I explained that the contract I had signed required personal references, not just from business partners, but from people who had known me in difficult seasons, and that the only person I had listed from the family was Lauren's old college roommate, who once saw me fail spectacularly at a pitch competition and then still show up the next day with notes, determination, and a refusal to quit. That detail landed heavier than anything else I could have said, because it revealed that when the stakes were highest, I had trusted someone who had witnessed my flaws honestly rather than someone who had spent years pretending my successes were hers to narrate. And as I pressed send, I felt no desire for a dramatic reconciliation, no craving for an apology that would likely never come. Instead, I felt an unshakable sense of peace in knowing that I had rewritten the script of my life in a way that no caption, no dinner invitation, and no family performance could ever erase. I know some people would want me to say we hugged, forgave, and moved forward as if nothing had happened, but the truth is more complicated and, to me, far more satisfying. We did not, because I no longer needed that kind of closure. What I needed, and what I finally had, was a life where I no longer measured my worth by who invited me to sit at their table, because I had built my own, and the only seats at it would be reserved for people who walked toward me with actions, not optics, and with truth, not stories designed to make themselves shine brighter at my expense.